Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual presentation, The Telegraph in America, 1832 to 1920. My name is Patrick Stenshorn. I am the Director of Interpretive Programs at the Albany Institute. Today, I am joined on the call by my colleague, Ellie Burhans, who is the development manager at the museum as well. She's going to be helping with some of the technical aspects of today's program. So if you do have any technical issues, sound, video, please send a message in the chat box to Ellie and she will be able to help you, and she'll also be watching the waiting room. So if you do get bumped out and you have to come back in, she'll be able to admit you pretty quickly. For tonight's presentation, please make sure that your microphone is on mute. If you are using a device that has a webcam, please feel free to have that turned on or off, whatever is your comfort level. There will be a question and answer session at the conclusion of tonight's presentation. We will utilize the chat box. So please, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. I will then read all questions to Professor Hochfelder at the end of today's presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker. David Hochfelder is an associate professor of history at the University at Albany. He is an electrical engineer turned historian who specializes in the history of U.S. business and technology. He also helps administer UAlbany's public history graduate program. Before joining UAlbany, Hochfelder served as a research historian at the Thomas Edison Papers. He is the author of the book, which is the basis of tonight's presentation, The Telegraph in America, 1832 to 1920, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2012. So please join me in welcoming David Hochfelder.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for checking in on a chilly late fall evening, and for putting up with Zoom and all its vagaries. I do have an Ethernet cable, so dropping out should not be a problem. But if it is, I apologize in advance. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. And before I get into the heart of the presentation, let me just explain sort of what motivated the book and my research on the telegraph. Basically, the significance of the telegraph as far as American society, culture, politics, economics, really arises from one very simple and straightforward fact. And that is that the telegraph forever liberated communication from transportation. So before the invention of the telegraph, if you wanted to transmit information or communicate with someone, you had to carry the information somehow, either in your head or in the form of a letter or other physical medium. After the invention of the telegraph, that was no longer the case. Now, that's not to say that right away in 1844, after Samuel Morse builds his first test line between Washington and Baltimore, that this transformation occurred overnight. The telegraph always was, at least throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, was always an expensive medium, best suited for time-sensitive information that businessmen, bankers, stockbrokers, commodities dealers, the newspaper press was willing to pay dearly for. So anything that was time-sensitive enough would be transmitted by telegraph at a fairly high cost. This is at a time when the Postal Service satisfy the communication needs of most ordinary everyday Americans. And you could send a letter within the 48, or the continental United States rather, for 3 cents. So a telegram would cost, between New York and Chicago, would cost several times that. Early on, a telegram between New York and Chicago would cost well over $1 in the currency of that day, in 1850s currency, which scaled up is probably about a factor of 20 or 30. So to send a 10-word message between New York and Chicago, say when the first line was built to Chicago in 1848, could cost the equivalent of $25 or $30 today. Whereas a postage stamp, then 3 cents, scaling up to today's postage of around 55 cents, That's a radical difference in cost. So even though the telegraph forever liberated communication from transportation, its market remained fairly limited until the mid or late 19th century. Most Americans, in fact, experienced telegraphy, if you will, not as a communications medium, but more as a source of information in their daily newspapers. So it really transformed how newspapers reported the news. Other than that, the telegram also had very negative connotations for people, especially after World War I, when the War Department would send telegrams to families informing them that their loved ones had been killed or wounded or died for medical reasons while serving in the armed forces during the war. So the telegram became associated with bad news. And I'll dwell on that a little bit further into the presentation. Now, I said that the telegraph forever liberated information and communication from transportation. And I alluded to 1844, which is the year that Samuel F.B. Morse builds his first experimental line with congressional funding, I might add, between Washington and Baltimore. However, there was a telegraph system that predates Morse, and this was an optical telegraph invented during the French Revolution by the Shep brothers, and I'm probably horribly butchering that name because French is not my language, Chappe. And in service of the French Revolutionary government in the 1790s, they constructed lines of these optical telegraphs that covered most of the country and were of great help in France's continuing wars against other European powers. Now, in other countries, like the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the United States, these optical or semaphore telegraphs were often deployed in harbors. So this is a Currier and Ives print of the telegraph station at, I believe, Sandy Hook in New Jersey, right across the harbor from downtown Manhattan. And here you see on the left-hand side those posts or poles. Those could be manipulated to send messages. And these were mainly used to alert merchants and ship owners of an arrival of a ship. So these were built following the War of 1812 in the United States. And if you've ever been to San Francisco, there's a Telegraph Hill. It's called Telegraph Hill because of that kind of telegraph, the semaphore optical telegraphs that announced ship arrivals. So in 1837, the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States sent out a circular to customs collectors and commanders of revenue cutters around the country, especially in the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico seaboard. And the Secretary of the Treasury, Levy Woodbury, basically asked them, do you think a telegraph is practical? And if so, what kind of telegraph would you like to see for transmitting information along our coasts? Woodbury received 17 replies. Some of them touted particular systems of optical telegraph. Others were from, again, customs collectors. The customs collector from Pensacola, Florida, for example, said, you know what? Telegraph system makes no sense down here. There's nothing between New Orleans and Savannah anyway, so why even bother? And that's likely to be true for the next century. One of the replies, however, was from a professor of fine art and a portrait painter named Samuel F.B. Morse. Now, Morse had made a career as a painter and taught painting at what is now New York University. And he announced to the Secretary of the Treasury and the United States government that he had a telegraph system that could work at night or in bad weather, which was often a problem with these optical telegraphs, and that the equipment was small enough to fit onto a tabletop. Maybe it would take up a couple cubic feet. And he said that as opposed to the couple hours it would take to transmit a message from, say, New York to New Orleans, his telegraph could do it in a matter of seconds, instantly, the speed of light, in fact, or the speed of an electrical signal through a copper wire. This strikes the observer, or me, more to the point, as strange because Morse had very little background in science or engineering. And the origin story to Morse's telegraph comes when he was returning on board ship in 1832, Morse had taken basically the grand tour of Europe, visiting the art galleries and cathedrals and so forth. Spent some time with James Fenimore Cooper's family in Paris. Spent a long time there. And he was returning back to the United States on a sailing vessel. And these voyages took 6 to 8 weeks at the time. And the way that passengers passed their time was engaging in learned conversation. So Morse fell into conversation with a man named Charles T. Jackson, who was a chemist living in Boston. Jackson had attended scientific lectures in Paris and told Morse basically that an electrical signal can travel instantaneously through a wire, and you can detect it through a chemical means or actuating an electromagnet. And Morse claims at that point that the idea for the telegraph came to him on board ship, and he sketched out a rough idea for one. He landed in New York, stayed with his brother and his family for a while, worked on his system. It didn't really work beyond a couple hundred feet of wire. So this perturbed him. And then in 1836, a chemistry professor at NYU, Leonard Gale, sees Morse's badly working prototype, or barely working prototype. And Gale says, well, surely you're familiar with the research of Joseph Henry on electromagnets. You know, Henry demonstrated that you can work an electromagnet at several miles distance from a battery. By the way, this is Joseph Henry. Many of you are probably familiar with this statue. Anyone know where this statue is? Okay, well, it's
Academy Park in downtown Albany.
Academy Park in downtown Albany, right in front of the Albany Academy where Joseph Henry taught. Now, as a bit of a tangent, I want to emphasize that in Henry's day, 1820s, 1830s, Albany punched above its weight, as it usually has throughout its history, in the world of science, especially. At the Albany Academy, which was somewhere between an elite prep school and a college, students could receive an advanced education in science, as advanced as the time permitted. Alongside Joseph Henry, who invented his electromagnets at the Albany Academy, the Beck brothers, Lewis and Roman Beck, were significant figures in the history of American chemistry. So Albany had leading American scientists in the 1820s and 1830s, Henry among them. And here's Henry with a picture, or the statue of Henry rather, with his magnet. So after Morse becomes aware of Henry's researches and incorporates Henry's magnet into his design, the range of his telegraph system goes up to about 10 miles. It's still crude, but it's ready for public demonstration, which Morse does in 1837. Morse spends the next several years until 1843 trying to convince Congress to either fund a prototype line or to buy his patent and, and operate the telegraph under the post office. Morse famously said that my telegraph, and I'm paraphrasing, is designed for the same purpose as the post office, that is to carry information, to transmit intelligence. And it should be operated in the public interest by the post office department, by the federal government, because at the time, Americans almost universally believed that the post office department had a constitutional monopoly on the transmission of information. So Morse initially wanted the telegraph, his telegraph, to be a government public utility. But that's another story. We'll return to that in a few minutes. When I said Morse didn't have much of a scientific or technical background, that's true to a certain extent, but Morse was also a tinkerer. Here is an early daguerreotype, or he was one of the early experimenters in photography. And here's a daguerreotype he took of himself in 1845. So he was, while he was a fine arts professor and a portrait painter, he also dabbled, like many educated Americans, in science and scientific pursuits. And you can get a sense of his age. I believe he was 53 years old or 54 years old when this was taken. So he invented the telegraph relatively late in life. Here's an image of him taken from a biography of his, showing him in old age, obviously, with his telegraph instrument at his right hand. And you see these scientific medals on his jacket. And sometime in the 1850s, several European countries awarded him medals of honor, scientific medals of honor, and a bit of a cash bounty as well to reward him for creating his telegraph. But for Morse, Morse was a vain man. Morse believed that he had invented not just one particular way of sending messages through electricity, but that he invented the entire notion of sending messages with electricity, which is clearly not true. And he did this in order to defend a very broad interpretation of his patent. Now, most drawn out patent litigation or patent suits ruin friendships and lives. And one of the friendships that was ruined was Morse's friendship and professional relationship with Joseph Henry, because Henry regarded himself as the true progenitor of electrical communications. Whereas Morse said, yeah, he did it in the classroom or in the laboratory, but I actually took it out into the world and built an actual working telegraph line. So the two men remained bitter enemies until both their deaths in the 1870s. By 1848, the United States, east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio and Potomac rivers, is covered with a network of telegraph lines. And the South has a pretty decent telegraph network by the eve of the Civil War. And in October 1861, several months after the Civil War had started, the telegraph reaches San Francisco. And this is several years, 7 or 8 years in advance of the Transcontinental Railroad. So by 1861, the entire country is covered in telegraph wires, even though the country is torn apart by the ongoing Civil War. The point is that you could send a message from New York to San Francisco at high cost, probably $5 or $6 for 10 words in contemporary money, probably $100 in today's money. So the next challenge was bridging the oceans, bridging the Atlantic Ocean. In the 1850s, you've probably heard of Lord Kelvin because there's a temperature scale named after him. Before he was named Lord Kelvin toward the end of his life by Queen Victoria, he was William Thomson, professor of physics in Scotland, I believe at University of Glasgow. And sometime in the early 1850s, a bunch of telegraph entrepreneurs come to Thomson, not quite yet Lord Kelvin. And they said, look, we want to build, we've connected England to France underwater. There's a cable between Italy and Libya, modern Italy and modern Libya. We're working on a cable to the Red Sea and then India. We also want to jump across the Atlantic and lay a submarine telegraph cable across the Atlantic. We don't really know how to do this. Can you come up with the math to help us out? I'm paraphrasing, obviously. So Thomson comes up with a theory, a mathematical theory of how signals are transmitted on submarine cables. This is a different problem in physics than simply telegraphs in the open air on posts, because salt water is an electrical conductor and sets up a capacitance, a storage of charge in the line, in the telegraph cable itself. So Thomson worked on this problem, came up with a mathematical solution, and then showed how his mathematics could guide the actual dimensions and construction of a cable. And then Thomson goes on, he's one of the most talented engineers and scientists of his generation. Then Thomson goes on to create the signaling system that would be used on long ocean cables. Now, this is from 1858, and this shows on the cable in the middle, and on the left-hand side is the USS Niagara. On the right-hand side is the HMS Agamemnon. The Atlantic cable was so big, it took 2 ships to carry it. The 2 ships met in the middle of the ocean, spliced the cable together. The Niagara sailed toward Newfoundland, and the Agamemnon, that's a tough one for me, sailed to the Irish coast. They try this first in 1857, the cable breaks, they can't find it. Then they put together more investors, more capital, build another telegraph cable in England, load up the 2 ships again. In August of 1858, they set sail. They reach their respective shores, and lo and behold, the Atlantic telegraph seems to work. There are 3 or 4 messages that pass. One message orders several regiments of British troops to remain in Canada. They had been ordered to travel to India to put down the Indian Mutiny, and the Indian Mutiny had been resolved by then. So one of the first telegrams under the ocean basically covered the cost by keeping the troops stationed in Canada and not transporting them to India. The British government basically recouped its investment on the telegraph cable with that one message. Then there was a message between Queen Victoria and President James Buchanan, and at that point it was pretty clear that the signaling capacity was down to a word or two a minute. And no one could quite figure out what was happening. The cable just went dead. And now we think that one of the electricians on the British side fried the insulation by trying to shove several thousand volts through the cable. We don't know if that's the case, but that's what the United Kingdom Government Board of Trade concluded in an official report a few years later. So they're going to try again. The American Civil War intervenes. The Civil War is over. In 1865, now there's a ship, the Great Eastern, which I don't have an image of, that Isambard Kingdom Brunel had built with a cargo hold large enough to carry enough coal to sail between England and Australia without stopping to refuel. That cargo hold, or that coal bin, whatever you want to call it, was big enough to accommodate the entire cable. So in 1865, the Great Eastern sets out with the telegraph cable, the cable snaps. So it's back to the drawing board, back to the workshops to build another 2,700 mile line of cable. At the same time, Western Union looks around and just recently has become the telegraph monopoly in the United States. More on that in a few minutes. Western Union looks around and says, you know, this Atlantic telegraph thing doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. Why don't we just take our line that goes to San Francisco, punch it up through Alaska, which was Russian America at the time. It's a short hop over the Bering Strait, or under the Bering Strait, more to the point. And then we can run the line through Siberia and connect into the Russian network, and that'll give us access to the European telegraph network. So Western Union does this and sends 3 or 4 expeditions to British Columbia, Alaska, and Siberia. And Western Union thinks, you know, they're going to control the global telegraph market through this overland telegraph line that they're building. However, in the summer of 1866, the Great Eastern sets out again with another telegraph cable, grapples up the 1865 cable, connects both at the Irish and the Canadian ends, and both lines work successfully, placing both continents in permanent electrical communication from the summer of 1866 to the present day. Now you may be wondering, what about those poor telegraph line builders stuck in Alaska and Siberia? Well, Western Union wasn't able to get to some of them until sometime in 1867, particularly the ones in Siberia. The upside is that we got Alaska through this. When the president of Western Union told Secretary of State William Seward that they were canceling the project, Seward communicated this to the Russian ambassador, and the Russian ambassador said, well, how much did Western Union spend on this effort? And it was something like $3 million in contemporary money. And the Russian ambassador said, well, hell, for that amount, we'll just sell you Alaska. So that's how we wound up with Alaska. I want to spool back a few years to the Civil War. This is a photograph taken by Alexander Gardner, a famous Civil War photographer, showing the construction of a military telegraph line. During the war, for the first time, the United States Army has a signal corps that operates battlefield communications mainly through semaphore, and then a rival outfit composed of civilian operators mainly, a few military officers who could order equipment and material and were serving basically as quartermasters. The US Military Telegraph Corps employed about 1,000 operators and linemen and built or operated several thousand miles of line during the war. And here you see a photograph taken by Gardner showing the construction of one of these lines. Now, this is significant not just for battlefield communications and overall strategy from the standpoint of the military. For those of you who've seen the movie Lincoln, you know that Lincoln spent a great deal of time in the War Department Telegraph Office. One way to think about this is the US military telegraph cemented civilian control of the Army during a very perilous time in our history. As a matter of fact, in the summer of 1861, General George McClellan wrote to his wife that he could become dictator, and that's a direct quote, if he so chose. So maintaining civilian control over the military through the telegraph was very significant in preserving what has been a cornerstone of American democracy and relationships between the military and civil authorities. So I'm not sure who took this photograph. It could be Matthew Brady, it could be Alexander Gardner. This shows an operating station that the US military telegraph or telegraphers in the Telegraph Corps were operating. And it's basically a lean-to tent, and the telegraph equipment, the key and the sounder, are on a box. It's not terribly sheltered from the elements. Doesn't look like it's a cold or rainy day, but you wouldn't want to be out in the sun for several hours operating either. So this gives you a sense of sort of the rough conditions that military telegraphers often endured. They shared the same hardships as infantry soldiers, lice, bed bugs, not being able to bathe for several days on end. So they shared the hardships and privations of frontline soldiers. However, these were young men, often away from home for the first time. And like young men in any historic period, you get a group of them together in their late teens or early 20s, hijinks are bound to ensue. And military telegrapher named William Rattle Plum wrote a 2-volume book after the war that was kind of a book of nostalgia about how fun it was to be a military telegrapher during the war. These operators were a highly prized commodity. They were in demand. They had necessary skills. They could create their own working conditions. Their salaries, they couldn't negotiate for their salaries, but they had a lot of autonomy in their work life. This is an image from Plum's book called Drawing Battery Material. You might wonder why the telegraph operator is on the ground while a military officer is looking in the tent. The legend here has it that several military telegraphers informed the commanders of the military posts that they operated from that they needed fresh battery acid to replenish the batteries every so often. And if battery acid couldn't be located, sulfuric acid couldn't be located, whiskey could stand in, but it had to be whiskey of the very highest quality. So these guys drank a lot. I looked at the papers of one of the senior people in the US military telegraph, and he wanted to fire an operator for drinking on the job, and he found he couldn't do it because operators were in such high demand that he actually wound up promoting him instead, hoping that would curb his drinking. Now, after the Civil War, Western Union becomes the nation's first industrial monopoly. There have been 6 major telegraph companies from the late 1850s through the Civil War. Western Union is able to acquire its rivals and establish a national telegraph monopoly in 1866, early 1866. This presents a truly novel problem in political economy. Never before in American history has one company monopolized an entire market. Now, the US Post Office Department did have a monopoly, but it's a public utility. This is the first time that a private corporation had a monopoly, a near total dominance of a highly important market to the nation's financial sector and journalism. This was a major problem, and between 1866 and World War I, routinely, there was something like over 100 bills introduced in Congress to nationalize Western Union and place it either under postal administration or the administration of the Army Signal Corps. So this is the first time that the United States confronts the problem of monopoly. And the way that the federal government deals with, or more to the point, does not deal with Western Union, sort of sets the dividing line between public and private enterprise. After the federal government proves unable, or Congress, reformers in Congress, prove unable to get enough votes to pass a postal telegraph bill to nationalize the telegraph, there's a clear line drawn between private communications networks and the post office, which is the public communications network. Now, across the ocean, Great Britain had nationalized its inland telegraphs and began operating them under the post office in 1870. This led to a very different outcome where in the UK, the telegraph becomes a social medium. People use it routinely, much at heavier levels than in the United States, where it's mainly a business medium. So it's sort of an interesting experiment to see two different approaches to the same problem in political economy. The UK nationalizes their telegraphs, the United States doesn't. So you have different ways the lines between public and private enterprise are drawn in the United States and in Great Britain. Now, being a monopoly is quite lucrative. And this is a cartoon from the Daily Graphic, which was, along with Punch and Judge, was a political cartoon newspaper, basically. And I'm not sure who drew this. I would have to look a little more closely. It could be Kepler, but I'm not certain. This cartoon is called Getting Ready to Cut the Melon. And here you see the leading figures in Western Union's management, the Vanderbilts, Russell Sage. Jay Gould is not yet in the mix because he's running a rival telegraph company. He'll take over soon enough. Jay Gould was probably the most hated man in America during his lifetime. So getting ready to cut the melon, this is a huge dividend that Western Union declares its shareholders in the middle of a depression sparked by the Panic of 1873. Now, admittedly, by 1878, the country is beginning to recover. But at the same time that Western Union is declaring basically a 100% stock dividend, its telegraph operators and workers are not receiving commensurate increases in their pay. So again, monopoly is lucrative, and this remained a huge problem in American political economy throughout the late 19th century. Now, as far as the impact on journalism, I had indicated in my introduction that the main way that most Americans encountered the telegraph was in the pages of their newspapers. And this created a newspaper page that could be best described as a juxtaposition or a collage with reports coming in from all over the country and even all over the world. And here you see a set of headlines from the Chicago Inter-Ocean during the 1877 Great Railroad Strike. And this just gives you a sense of the volume and type of news that the Telegraph transmitted to newspapers, which then published stories. So the main headline is, "In affirmant, the country continues in this condition, full reports, what our cable correspondents say, anxiety among the holders of American railroad securities, another cabinet meeting, the government quelling the rioting, probability the volunteers for the regular army will be called up." So you get a sense of this juxtaposition of different kinds of news stories, even about the same general news, big news story. The kinds of juxtaposed items that newspaper readers would encounter in their daily papers. Another way to look at this, a few years after this, when James Garfield, Civil War general, math professor at Hiram College in Ohio, matter of fact, he proved a mathematical theorem on the floor of the House of Representatives, is probably the only member of the House of Representatives in US history to get published in a scientific journal while sitting in Congress. A beloved figure in the Republican Party, elected as president, takes office in 1881. In March, a few months later, he's shot at a railroad station in Washington, DC. He lingers throughout the summer, finally succumbing to his wounds in September. People were transfixed by this, out of concern for the president, obviously. And this is a bulletin board in front of a hotel or a newspaper office. And here you see a man writing out the official bulletins as transmitted by the Telegraph. And the newspaper press was obsessed with Garfield's medical condition. And you can tell from the crowds that as his condition worsened, it was also a matter of deep public concern as well. This gives you a sense of the immediacy with which Americans began consuming the news. It's fair to say that the Telegraph created what we would call the news cycle, the modern news cycle. You know, we have an expectation that the news will be delivered to us quickly, especially if you watch a lot of cable news. This really originated with the Civil War and the Telegraph's coverage of battles, and then really intensified during issues like the Great Railroad Strike or President Garfield's lingering injuries. Now, just to give you a sense of the wire infrastructure of the country, or the financial sector especially. This is a famous photograph of Wall Street, or the financial district, during the blizzard of 1888. And this really brings into sharp relief, thanks to the snow and the ice, just how extensive the telegraph and telephone networks were in downtown New York. And one commentator noted that you could probably walk across downtown New York on telegraph wires. So this gives you a sense of the infrastructure that made the nation's financial sector what it was and what it still is. This is the plant room of the New York Stock Exchange. Here you see ticker machines. This is where stock quotations went out onto the telegraph network in the form of stock quotations, or I'm sorry, in the form of on stock tickers. Western Union operated the bulk of the nation's stock tickers. The New York Stock Exchange had an independent network that covered Manhattan, basically. Western Union also operated parallel network of tickers that are called its sporting wire or sporting ticker. And that carried results of horse races at baseball games and boxing matches. And this drove the first form of organized crime in the country, gambling syndicates. James O'Leary, who is the son of Mrs. O'Leary, whose cow started the Chicago fire, supposedly, her son James controlled the gambling in Chicago through his ownership of the sporting ticker franchises. So you can get a sense of how early organized crime really arose out of Western Union's facilitation of gambling. Here you see brokers on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange reading the ticker. I think this is a staged photograph, personally, that the stock exchange took for publicity purposes, but it does give you a sense of how the stock ticker helped create modern financial capitalism. This is a Charles Dana cartoon, I believe, showing a merger hog, the man's name, taking a much needed rest at his country home. And here you see the figure of a financier with the stock ticker, a wastebasket full of paper tape, a typist behind him, a man on the telephone behind the tree, and then two dozing West Union messenger boys. So this gives you a sense of the technological apparatus or infrastructure that really supported the financial system in the country at around the turn of the 20th century. And here's what a broker's office would have looked like. And here you see the quotations being chalked up on the chalkboard, the customer on the left looking at the ticker, a few customers sitting in the chair watching the market. Many avid speculators spent hours and hours in their broker's offices to get up-to-date minute-to-minute quotations. This is a brokerage house in Boston. This is a message blank from 1911 from Western Union. And this gives you a sense of just how massive the global, national and global information infrastructure was at the time. By this point, you could send a message from any railroad station in the United States to virtually any place on the globe. There are some places, obviously, the Sahara Desert, you're probably not going to get a message to. But if you wanted to send a message from Keokuk, Iowa to St. Petersburg, Russia, you could do it. It would cost you, but you could do it. Now, as I said in my introduction, most Americans encountered the telegraph either through their newspaper pages or in the form of bad news like deaths in the family, really reinforced after World War I. Diane, I think this is from your collection, in fact. This is, so in the 1930s, Western Union realized they had a marketing problem. Message traffic peaks in the 1920s and declines thereafter. Western Union decides it's going to get into the greetings business. And in many ways, you can draw a link between Western Union's greeting telegrams and the greeting card industry of today, what remains of it. So if you wanted to send a birthday greeting, a wedding greeting, an anniversary greeting, you could do that. All you had to do was pick a particular 2-number code, and Western Union would take that code and turn it into this decorative telegram, and then charge you 50 cents or thereabouts for it. So Western Union, after it had kind of been superseded by the telephone and airmail, really tried to rebrand itself as a social medium and not simply an expensive business medium. Western Union continued to decline, had a bit of an uptick during the 1940s during the war, but continued to decline. Long distance telephone service, airmail, And after the 1960s and 70s, early computing, networked computing, began cutting into Western Union's market share as a long-distance communications medium. So in response, in the 1960s and 70s, Western Union decides it's going to transform itself into an information utility. Builds a network of computers that companies can buy time on, builds a microwave relay link that blankets the country, and in the 1970s launches satellites. And here you see its first Westar satellite, I believe it's its first, being launched in 1974. Now these satellites didn't carry telegrams, they carried television programming. So Western Union tried to become an information utility. Matter of fact, Western Union worked on an early form of email in the late 70s and early 80s. Western Union did not survive. Obviously, the logo and the money exchange service does, but Western Union as a corporate entity no longer exists. They could not compete in the world of email and cheapening long distance phone calls. So Western Union sent its last telegram right after the turn of the 21st century. And I don't even know if it's possible. I don't even know why you would want to send a telegram today. Morse code is still in active use among amateur radio operators. And if you have a shortwave radio, you can go to the amateur radio bands and listen to Morse code conversations all the time. But the telegram and Western Union as a going concern both no longer exist. So Western Union had a 150-year history, and the purposes to which it was put are mainly satisfied now through email, texting, and virtually costless or free long-distance phones through our cell phones. Okay, thank you. That's my presentation. I'd be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you, David. That was very informative. Yes, this is the point in the night where if you do have a question for Professor Hochfelder, please feel free to type it into the chat box now. Dave, do you know what was Western Union's last telegram? Do you know what the message was?
No.
Okay.
That's an interesting question, though. I'd love to find out. But no, I don't. Steve asks, was telegraphy a mature technology by 1920, or are there further improvements possible? The answer is yes to both halves of your question. I'm going to try and be as concise and succinct as possible. I have an entire book chapter about this. By the Civil War, telegraphy was a mature technology. Thomas Edison invented a method of sending 4 messages simultaneously. The stock ticker was invented right around the same time in the 1870s. And those were significant innovations to telegraphy. But by the turn of the century, Western Union had become a hidebound, moribund corporation that thought it had a locked-in market and didn't bother to innovate. So AT&T comes along under Theodore Vail, a very dynamic president and corporate statesman, and AT&T acquires Western Union in 1909. It's forced to disgorge it under threat of antitrust prosecution in 1914. But Western Union comes away with some of Bell's intellectual property, especially with automatic telegraphy that is using a typewriter keyboard effectively to send a telegram, and some carrier current technology, which is basically using oscillators and amplifiers based on the electronic vacuum to create many circuits over one coaxial cable. So yes, by 1920, not much is going to happen. Western Union does innovate a bit after World War II with respect to a microwave network that supplants its wire network. But innovation has gone over to AT&T, especially Bell Labs. And researchers at Bell Labs win several Nobel Prizes for inventing the transistor, for discovering the microwave cosmic background radiation, and inventing radio astronomy, and a few other Nobels that are escaping me. So innovation really moves away from Western Union and the telegraph into the telephone industry and radio and television as well. So it's considered a backwater industry by 1920 and certainly by 1940.
April asked, what happened to the satellite? I'm assuming the West Star satellite.
I have no idea. At the time, satellites tended to have limited lifespans, so I assume it was responsibly deorbited and crashed into the ocean somewhere, but I don't have a good answer for that. I actually never bothered to ask that very question, but that's an excellent question. I can't answer it, unfortunately.
William asked, are the undersea cables still used for anything?
The cables themselves are not. The cable stations, some are used as internet relay stations or fiber optic relay stations for telephone fiber optics cables. Heart's Content, Newfoundland, where the Atlantic cable landed. It's a small fishing village, has a very nice cable museum. The records of the station itself are in the provincial archives with a microfilm copy at the Smithsonian, which I've looked at. And I was there in 2001, and this is an actual piece of the cable, one of the cables. I don't know if it's the 1866 cable or a 1925 cable. They just come right out of the ocean and they're slowly corroding. So I don't consider this, an act of archaeological vandalism, because this would have corroded away by now anyway.
Linda asked, did the telegraph penetrate Africa, Australia, and when?
In the late 19th century, Australia builds a north-south line between, I think it's Port Darwin and I want to say Adelaide. I'm not terribly familiar with the geography. The coastal sections of Australia have a developed telegraph network, the interior a little later. Africa, interesting story. There's a conflict between the British and the French that threatens to turn into a full war over, I believe it's the Sudan. And the British have a telegraph link back to London and are able to basically take orders from military headquarters in London. And the French have to borrow the British telegraph network to send messages to and from Paris. So the British had a highly developed telegraph system in India and in Africa. The French lag a little bit behind, but certainly by the turn of the 20th century, many portions of places like Africa and Asia had, highly developed telegraph networks.
Bria asked, first, how quickly did telegraphy replace the Pony Express and other travel-based communication?
My understanding is the Pony Express doesn't last very long, a matter of months. Again, thinking of one communications network replacing another, we tend to think that way because we think of technological innovations as sequenced, right? You get the telegraph, you get the telephone, you get wireless, you get radio broadcasting, and so forth. But look, prior communications media still exists. We still use the postal system, at least a little bit. Amateur radio operators still use wireless telegraphy. Some railroads in Mexico and India still use wired telegraph systems for train dispatching into the 1990s. So technologies really don't disappear or are entirely superseded, or if they are, the process is much more gradual.
Bria also asked, did the organized crime groups created around the sports telegraph network remain in place as technology changed, or were they replaced by other groups?
That's a good question. Western Union gets out of the gambling business when its major investor, Helen Gould, the daughter of Jay Gould, basically says, this is immoral and I will leave the board of Western Union and sell off my stock unless you get rid of this business. This is in 1906, I believe, or 1907. So Western Union formally withdraws from sports gambling, but it's taken over by essentially a front company. After Prohibition, the money really in organized crime really moves into alcohol and then later drugs. So I don't know the history of organized crime sufficiently well to answer that question either.
Bree did a little quick digging on the West Star satellite, and I put it into the chat box that the satellite was retrieved by shuttle astronauts in 1984, refurbished and relaunched as Asia Satellite 1 in 1990. And then we, from William, we have, hi David, you only mentioned the Morse code in passing. Clearly the system would not have worked without the code. Can you tell us a little bit about the development of the code?
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about the development of the code, because this is a controversy that the sons of Samuel Morse and one of his co-workers, Alfred Vail, perpetuated well into the 20th century. Alfred Vail's son claimed that Vail invented Morse code and that Morse robbed him of the credit. That's not the case. At first, with the optical telegraphs that we talked about at the beginning, the way that these worked is you would send a 3-digit number, and then you'd observe through a telescope, you'd see the flags and indicator, or the wooden panels that would indicate a 3-digit number. You would go to a book, a dictionary, you would look up that number and translate that into a word. So Morse spent a lot of time developing this so-called dictionary when he first developed his telegraph. And then he realized, wait a minute, what if I have to send a proper name? I need an alphabet too. So he thought of this as sort of an afterthought. Like, he really wanted to do the dictionary, and then he realized that if you're going to send a proper name, you're going to need individual letters. And then he thought about it and he said, well, why do I need the dictionary in the first place? As far as Alfred Vail's claim, or Vail's son's claim, Alfred Vail himself, and I've looked at his papers at the Smithsonian and the New Jersey Historical Society, never publicly or privately claimed that he invented the code. But don't say that at Historic Speedwell in Morristown, New Jersey. They don't like that. I speak from personal experience. It's Alfred Vail's father's workshop and iron mill. Vail claimed a lot of things. He claimed to have invented the telegraph key, which he did. He claimed to have invented an improved sounder, or receiver, which he did. But he never, ever publicly or privately said he came up with the code. So I think it's pretty clear that this was Morse's idea. American Morse code is different from continental Morse, which is what amateur radio operators use. American Morse uses spaced characters. I believe the letters C and R are 2 dots followed by a space followed by a dot, or a dot followed by space followed by 2 dots, which is very, very confusing and led to mistakes, quite frequent mistakes in sending messages. The continental system doesn't have that issue, and that's why it's universally used.
So that was the last question that has come through. I'll give it just another couple seconds. If anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to type them into the chat box now. April said, thank you all very much. And I do want to thank you as well, David, for your presentation. It was very, very informative, very good. And I definitely want to thank you for doing it for us tonight. And it looks like that's the last question that came through. So I'll give a virtual round of applause for you. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. David, thank you very much for your presentation. I hope everybody has a great rest of your evening, and hopefully we'll get to see you all at the museum sometime soon.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Take care.